Well, thanks for coming. Thank you. You know, obviously the most life-changing, incredible experience of my life. November 5th, 1975. I was, just an ordinary work day, 7 of us out there. In the movie there was only 5, but, they simplified things to a great extent. So, there was actually 7 people. And my interpretation over the years has evolved. I've had a lot of time to think about it. And I had to overcome a lot of emotional bias, really, in trying to, figure out the meaning of this. And so it's come away since back then. I was accepting of the idea that they were portraying this as very horrific, because for me at the time it was. It was absolutely the most traumatic experience of my life ever since. Anything else that I've been involved in just pales by comparison. I got into the martial arts and did some boxing and stuff and bull riding. None of that sort of stuff brought anywhere near the kind of fear that we went through that night. And the other crewmen, or if you've ever seen interviews with them, are pretty unanimous in the idea that this was absolutely the most traumatic event of our lives. John Gillette was talking to the crew from National Geographic a while back, and he was saying even though he had served in Vietnam, that night was the most frightening time of his life. Steve Pierce said, he thought the world was coming to an end, and it's been so traumatic that for some of these men, it still has powerful, powerful emotional effects to recall. So here we were, we've been working hard all day, and we started to get dark. We loaded up our equipment and we're headed out of there. And, in the movie it gives the impression that we've been driving for some time and had, maybe got a little drowsy. It looked like the crew was drifting off. But actually we had not gone very far. And the importance of that point is that, our senses were really keen because we had just recently been doing some very hard physical labor. And, there was a lot of really animated conversation going on in the truck, everybody back and forth, mostly kind of broke up into 2s and 3s. And so, when I first caught sight of this little glimmers coming through the trees, I wasn't all that alarmed. A lot of people, hear about loggers in Arizona. They think that's kind of strange. They think Arizona's all sand and cactus. But, the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world is in northern Arizona. And so that was up on the Mogollon Rim there, 7,000 some feet. One of the highest points anywhere except for San Francisco Peaks over there by Flagstaff. And so, we all lived in Snowflake at the time, and we'd drive 30 miles out to Heber and then 15 miles of dirt road back up in there. So it was quite a drive. People, on the crew would fall asleep on the way out, but certainly nobody was asleep already by the time we caught sight of this glow coming through the trees. And these are the other 6 besides myself. Mike Rogers, the crew boss in the upper left, Kim Peterson in the center there, and Alan Dallas in the upper right. Lower left there is Dwayne Smith, 6'7", and John Gillette, he was just got out of the Navy, as did Alan Dallas. And then Steve Pierce, unbeknownst to us, the youngest guy on the crew, he lied about his age to get the job. He was only 17. He was played by Henry Thomas in the movie. I don't know if you recognize that was the little boy in the movie E.T. That was kind of an interesting touch there, and that was me back then. The crew truck, that's how you get 7 people into one truck, it's a double cab truck. So we're driving along, catching glimpses of this light coming through the trees, and I think, at first I thought, well, maybe some deer hunters, It was out of the ordinary, but it wasn't like everybody immediately said, what the heck is that? And got everybody looking that way. It's just kind of one by one, all these little conversations between the crews started dropping off, and everybody's looking the same direction, trying to figure out what this was. And you could see that the light was coming from, we were going south up this ridge from where we've been working, and the crest of the ridge was to our right, but the light was coming from higher than where you would estimate ground level to be, through this thick growth of trees, because this was an area we hadn't cut through yet, so it was pretty thick. And it crossed my mind, and probably some of the other guys, that this was possibly a forest fire, because we had, on the way to work, run into situations where there'd been a lightning strike the night before and caught a tree on fire, and we'd stop and put it out, As a matter of fact, at certain times, when there were forest fires, the Forest Service, knowing we were working in the area and had experience with falling timber and whatnot, would come and get us, and then we would go help them fight the fire. Well, so that crossed our minds, but immediately that was dismissed because it had been clear, dry weather, and this was evening rather than being in the morning. So anything going on that day we would have been aware of, and the idea that it was deer hunters, seemed plausible. Maybe camped up there because we've been hearing shots in the distance. It was deer hunting season, but John Boyd said that he thought, could it be the moon? And then he looked off to the other direction and could see the moon over there. So we knew it wasn't the moon. And I could see up ahead there was a break in the trees where the source of this light was shining sort of across our path. I said, Mike, hurry up, get up there. Oh, we can see what it is. Because by then everybody was really pretty curious what was going on. And it was pretty slow going on this little rough track there. It was just more of a logging trail. It's been completely closed off now. As a matter of fact, if you were hiking through there, you wouldn't even be able to detect that there'd ever been a road there. So, we bounced along and really scraping through there in the truck. And as soon as we got up to where that light was shining across the road, that's when we saw the craft hovering there. And Alan Dallas in the back yelled out, "It's a flying saucer!" It was just so undeniable, so unmistakable what we were looking at. There it was less than 100 feet away, like from less than from here to the back of this room. And it was just, excuse me. It was just such an amazing sight. I got out of the truck and I was just looking at this thing and just stunned, utter amazement, and everybody on the crew was feeling the same way. But, it was just me that opened the truck and door and headed up towards it. And a couple of the crew guys, in interviews, said that it looked to them like I was in some kind of a trance. And, I've been kind of denying that because, it did not feel to me like I was under outside control. They said to them it looked like I was. And, I disagree with that, but, I do have to admit that if these beings had a way of controlling you, they could probably make you think it was your idea too. But to me, I was just, seized with the curiosity of seeing it up close, with the idea that, it was going to be gone in a flash. And it's because it's a kind of a normal situation when we're driving through the woods. and you know, you catch sight of a deer or a fox or, you know, bobcat, whatever, and you call the attention of the rest of the crew members to it. You say, look over there, you know, and they're lucky if they can turn their head fast enough to even see it, because, you know, it's just a fleeting glimpse. So that was kind of, you know, the preconceived notion that I had there, that by the time I got closer to it, it would already be, you know, leaving. But what I was doing was, you know, really risky and, you know, a lot of bravado going on there, but, you know, a little touch of show off to it, but I have to admit, but mostly curiosity, just amazement. Closer I got, you know, the astounding, it was just an imposing, powerful sort of feeling. And, but the closer I got, the scarier I got, and those guys were getting really scared by what I was doing, and they started, you know, just like in the movie, yelling and cussing at me to get back in the truck and calling me names, and, but they weren't getting out. But the closer I got, and then, you know, I got up to the point where I was kind of looking up at it about a 45-degree angle, and it was glowing. Parts of it were not glowing, but it was like the surface was all one surface, like it was smooth as glass, shiny, but giving off light. And you know how when you're sitting there looking at the television in the daytime and the window's open, you can still see the window reflected on the TV, even though the TV's giving off light? It was like that. You know, the craft was glowing, but I could still see the surrounding trees and the ground and whatnot reflected in this glass-like surface. And it was just such a powerful, amazing thing. I was just standing there in awe. And, you know, the crew member, even those guys, you know, especially John Gleb, you know, they were in stunned amazement at the grandeur of this thing. At the same time, you know, it was terribly frightening, and they were still overcome with that. And one thing that Mike, the crew boss, said was, it seemed like something was about to happen. And, you know, I kind of felt that as I got closer. It was kind of like the hair standing on the back of your neck, but it wasn't just the fear. It was, I think, a kind of a electrical charge building up in this craft. Because when I was standing there looking up at it, suddenly it got louder and started to move upward slowly. And it wasn't steady, it was kind of rocking unsteadily. And I don't know if that was, they were trying to be careful because I was so close or whatever, but I was startled by the increase in the sound mostly, and I jumped forward and down into a crouch. And part of why I had stopped at that point was that I couldn't get much closer because there was a pile of logging debris there, and there was this big log sticking up out of the pile. And this was from logging operations the previous year. So that all this material had been gathered up there so they could burn it when the ground was covered with snow. But I jumped down forward and down into a crouch, and I got down behind that log. And you know, at that point, the crew was just going crazy with fear and screaming at me to get the hell out of there. You know, I did not need to be told. You know, this was something I was thinking about. Boy, what have I got myself into now? You know, I got to get out of here. So I decided to sprint back to the truck, and I stood up. And at that point, that was the point at which my head and chest were closest to it. And that's when that energy come out of the bottom of that craft. You know, at first, you know, everyone interpreted it as being like something that was fired at me, you know, like a weapon or some kind of automatic defense thing. But, you know, after all these years, I'm thinking that probably, you know, closing that gap at that point, that critical point when it's powering up to leave, generated some kind of force that leaped to the ground through my body. And in the movie, it looks like this spotlight comes on and just sort of freezes the actor and then just sort of tosses him back. But it was actually far more violent than that. And it's really surprising that Hollywood, missed an opportunity to have a light show, because anytime there's an explosion or fire or flames or anything like that, they always just, it's much bigger than you'd ever see in real life. But in this case, they actually toned it way down from what it was. It was far more violent than that. They compared it to me stepping on a landmine or a grenade going off, because the blast of the energy, actually made a sound, and it threw me through the air. Some of the crew said it was like 10 feet, some said it was 20 feet. But, my body's tumbling through the air, and this ball of energy, this, brilliant, Steve said it was the brightest thing he'd ever seen in his life. And some of the crew that were looking in a different direction said that it lit the woods up as far as you could see, brighter than the noonday sun. And so, the violence of this thing caused them to immediately conclude that it killed me. And, they said they were screaming at each other, he's dead, he's killed, we're next, and so they took off. And, I used to come and give talks, and people would very often remark that the crew had been unheroic, that they had been cowardly in taking off at that point. But I have to disagree with that, and there was quite a little bit of hard feelings about that issue. It came up between me and Mike, and certainly my family, even before I was returned, were really reproachful of the crew for not being more, like I said, heroic. But Mike was responsible for the safety of his entire crew. Logging is one of the most dangerous occupations in the entire United States. And so, his concern was to get everyone to safety. And it would have made no sense for them to, risk their lives to save somebody they think is already dead. My body tumbling through this ball of energy and landing, Mike said the dust and smoke looked like it was boiling up off me. But when they got down the road, Dwayne Smith says, I think it blew into pieces. I think he would disintegrate it. And Steve told the rest of the crew, he said, no, I kept my eyes on him the whole time, even before we, took off in the truck. And he was in one piece when he hit the ground. But, they were so convinced of the violence of that, when they finally got a grip and were headed back, and, Ken Peterson said that his greatest fear returning was not that the craft would still be there, because they did see, it rise up and take off. His greatest fear was, having to look at what my body would look like when they got there. So I give those guys a lot of credit for finally, getting the grip and collecting themselves and deciding that they had to come back to see if they could rescue me. Because it would have been perfectly understandable at that point to just keep going and go straight to the authorities, it's just too dangerous. But they actually had that courage. Now there was, some debate about that. And in the movie, when Mike pulls over and says, look, we gotta go back, and the crew didn't want to go, Mike says, okay, whoever doesn't want to go, wait here. In the movie, everybody gets out and Mike goes back alone. That's not the way it happened. None of those guys were willing to get out and wait there, alone in the dark. Are you kidding me? Like it or not, they all went back, So, as I said, as they got closer, they saw this light come up through, it had to be that craft, streaking back behind the trees and taking off. So they were a little more, secure in approaching the area, but still extremely scared. They found the place where the truck had just spun out when they took off escaping. And they said they got out and made a search there, and at one point Mike fell to his knees and started crying. And Ken Peterson helped Mike up, and he got his composure back, and he reassumed the role of leader to try to guide the situation. They decided to go back, and there was a lot of debate about whether to go, you know, to the authorities. And, you know, some of the guys were saying, let's just not do that. You know, Alan Dallas said, you know, we'll just be in trouble if we go to the cops. They're not going to believe us. Let's just get some friends with guns and we'll come back. And, you know, then if Travis isn't, you know, wandering around the woods in a daze or something, then we can go to the cops. But the others argued that they had to stay honest through the whole thing. It was already going to be very difficult to be believed. And so they decided to call in the authorities. And it was Kent Peterson who called the local deputy, and he was afraid to, you know, give him everything, you know. He was saying one of our friends is, one of our crew is possibly injured or lost or something. So the deputy comes down there and then they tell him the story, and he calls the sheriff. The sheriff's in Holbrook, and so the sheriff brings his undersheriff, his second in command, with him, and they come down there, and you know, immediately these lawmen are impressed that something really terrible has happened. You know, some of these guys are still crying, they're all white and shaky, but being police, they naturally were thinking of foul play, and they suspected that there had possibly been a fight, maybe with chainsaws or something, you know, and that I'd been killed. And that for some reason the others were willing to cover up with this crazy story about a UFO in order to, you know, explain my disappearance. But unlike in the movie, they really did go back that night. The lawmen took half the crew back with them. You know, they had to be shown exactly where the spot was and everything. And the other half of the crew went back into town, you know, report why everybody was so late to the wives and whatnot, girlfriends. Anyway, so again, I give great credit to the crewmen who did go back with the lawmen that night to see if they could rescue me. Oops, I'm not supposed to hit that button. I'll let Hillary fix that one. Anyway, so the sheriff organized a massive search. You know, they had a minor search that night. They did what they could there, and they got over 50 men, some people on horseback. You know, it was the Forest Service people, search and rescue people. There was volunteers, even some civilian volunteers. And the sheriff requested everyone's cooperation in keeping a lid on it, to not, you know, create a panic in the community. And, you know, they didn't want anybody going to the news media, which of course didn't last very long. Before too long, there were news crews from foreign countries, and it was just a madhouse. The men were under tremendous pressure from the townspeople, people, you know, accusing them of murder, and, you know, just driving by and calling out things, and they were under a lot of pressure. And, you know, John Willett said that when they went out there to help with the search, that the sheriff put an officer with each of the crewmen. And this officer continually pushed each of them, you know, Cam, John, Mike, Alan, you know, pushing at him. Come on, tell us the truth. You know, somebody killed Travis, and if they did, you know, you're not the guilty one. You're only going to be in trouble if you cover up for him. So tell us where you hid the body. So they were under this tremendous pressure, and at one point, you know, there was a kind of a violent confrontation between one of the searchers and Dwayne Smith, who grabbed him by the shirt and said, "Where'd you hide the body?" And at that point, they started yelling, "No, you know, we're telling the truth. You give us truth serum, you give us lie detector tests, anything you want. We're telling the truth." And so the sheriff took him up on it and brought in the state lie detector expert, Yeah. The search really got wider and wider, and eventually involved airplanes and helicopters and tracking dogs. The dogs were unable to find a scent trail beyond, from where I left the truck up to the middle of the clearing. And the horses that some of these searchers were riding were behaving rather strangely, and there was a report that one of them just bolted and, had been lost. They couldn't find it. So they brought in Cy Gilson, the state police lie detector expert. The top man in the state, working for, like I said, the Department of Public Safety in Arizona, testing people who were, had been arrested for serious crimes like murder and some people who were actually in prison, and a lot of years of experience, most highly trained, highly qualified person in the state. And so the men, when they were tested, were taken to the courthouse, and the sheriff's office, the jail, the courthouse were all in the same building. So when these guys went in there, they knew if anything went wrong with that testing, they weren't leaving that building. And they were pretty apprehensive about it, and they started having misgivings about the intentions of the law enforcement people. They were pushing this murder thing so strongly that the men suspected that the sheriff was probably interested in kind of sweeping the whole thing under the rug and to reassure the community it was nothing but a little murder, a little murder. That something as bizarre and frightening as a UFO abduction couldn't occur. So they were suspicious that the testing was rigged, and they got in a big argument with the examiner. But Gillespie managed to calm everybody down and convince them that the testing was on the up and up. And so the testing proceeded. And initially it was announced that one of the crewmen had had an inconclusive, and that was Alan Dallas, the big hothead. And he got in an argument with the examiner. Now, normally in a polygraph test, you'll do 3 or 4 runs through the test, and it's an identical run of the test. Each question has to be just like the other one. And they do this so that any little reaction that comes out on the charts is verified by being on the same question at the same point for all 3 or 4 runs through the test. And that allows them to eliminate some, a random fluctuation, just being some kind of an anomaly rather than an indication of deception. So Alan, having only done 2 runs through the questions, just tore off his instruments, the pickups, his sensors, and stomped out of the room and slammed the door. And so they didn't try to test him further. So they ruled it inconclusive, but later on, we got a copy of the sheriff's file, and there was a report in there by one of the officers who said that Alan, quote, had basically told the truth. But that later became a moot point because Alan was retested by Cy Gilson years later after the movie was undertaken, and he passed with flying colors. And by then, Cy Gilson had many more years of experience and was using even more refined techniques with the computer-assisted scoring system. And it was at that point that Mike and I took tests also. So at that point, Mike, Alan, and myself had all taken 2 tests from this expert. But getting back to the murder thing, Cy Gilson reported that in the Sci-Fi Channel's Paranormal Witness that aired recently, that when he announced the verdict to the sheriff, that the sheriff was pretty stunned. He fully expected to find that these guys had committed a murder. And there's even some, speculation that Alan's inconclusive, had something to do with him trying to drop a tree on me and you know, being accused and feeling like being the black sheep of the crew, that if anything happened, they were going to hang it on him. But, so, at the time that the crew passed the tests, the president of the American Polygraph Association, Edward Gelb, said that and he was talking about this incident. He said the odds of there being any kind of an error were over 1,000,000 to 1 when you have that many people tested on the same issue. And that was back with 6 tests, and by now there have been 16 passed lie detector tests in connection with this incident. I've passed 5 different tests from 3 different examiners, all of whom were highly trained people with years of law enforcement experience. So the sheriff was really stumped at that point, and you know, but he's always, you know, been in a difficult position because, you know, he's an elected official. And there's a lot of more powerful conservative old guard that would prefer that he not endorse such a crazy idea as UFO abduction. So his public stance has always been rather skeptical, neutral. But even though, you know, the night that this happened, he revealed to the crew that he himself had had a sighting pretty up close in the same county. But it remains, you know, that the sheriff is still an elected official as a county supervisor, so his public stance is still, you know, trying to say that he thinks that something else happened there. However, I have had a number of emails from his close associates and relatives who say privately he's more believing than he lets on publicly. However, when I woke up, I was in a lot of pain, a tremendous amount of pain. It was so painful that I just actually would kind of regain consciousness and then lose consciousness again. And I was kind of in and out. I didn't just wake up real quickly, but when I finally did come to some degree, I opened my eyes and I tried to look, and there was a light above me, and even though it wasn't very bright, it just hurt to look in that direction. But so I looked down and see what was pressing on my chest, and there was this thing laying there. But, you know, I was kind of had this welling up of feeling of panic in me already because, you know, it seemed like I could not get enough air. And I've explained this before, that the feeling of suffocation is a trigger for panic that, you know, really overrides every other cause you might have for you know, fear. In the recent movie that I saw, Lone Survivor, they showed the Navy SEALs being trained by having their hands and feet tied together, and they throw them in a swimming pool. And these guys basically drown, and then they drag it back out. And the whole idea being that they have to overcome fear that operates on such a basic, instinctive level that, you know, there's just no control in it. And, you know, the big issue about waterboarding terrorists is supposedly torture, but, you know, the terrorists know it's coming. They've trained to resist it, you know, in their training. All of our own special ops people undergo that training, and yet it still works. Even though they know it's coming, they know they're not going to die, it still makes them talk in order to avoid any further waterboarding, because the feeling of suffocation is just something you can't reason away. So, you know, without belaboring that point too much, you know, I'm trying to explain why I just completely became out of my mind with fear at that point. Because I woke up and I'm thinking, you know, where am I? I didn't even know where I was. And I thought, well, maybe I'd gotten hurt, you know, when I went to run back to the truck, maybe I hit my head or something. And I was thinking that maybe the crew had taken me to the hospital. I thought I was in a hospital. I could hear the sounds of the doctors moving around me. I was having trouble focusing my eyes. It was all blurry, and even a little bit of like double vision at times where, you know, each of my eyes was operating independent of the other. So when I could finally focus more, you know, and I was just looking above me at the ceiling, and the ceiling was shaped, you know, it wasn't square, and you know, it just didn't make any sense. And I heard this sound, and I looked to my right, and I could see the face of this creature. You know, when I could finally focus, this was not a doctor wearing a surgical mask and cap, you know. This was a creature with, you know, this bulging, hairless cranium and these huge eyes. Well, that, you know, shot of fear that hit me right then was so powerful that it gave me the strength to, you know, actually raise my arm up, because I was so weak. It just took a tremendous amount of effort to just, you know, try to hit him away, but it was just more of a soft push. But even with that, this creature fell back easier than I expected. It was a lot lighter and softer than I thought it would be. But I rolled away from it, and this thing they had on my chest fell off. And I staggered back, just trying to catch my balance, but I was trying to get away from them because they immediately started to come around the table and come towards me. And they were extending their hands, and I bumped up against this shelf. It was kind of like a workbench sort of thing behind me. And I just looked to see what I bumped into, and I could see these things laid out there. And I just grabbed the biggest thing I could find, because they were coming at me. And I was just so terrified. I was screaming, and I was just flailing with this thing to keep them from coming any closer. And they kept coming and extending their hands, but they were staring at me, and that just, you know, pushed the fear right to the max. And when they stopped and they were looking at me, their eyes just seemed to stare right into me in a way that, you know, was just so unbearable. It was excruciatingly intrusive, invasive. It gave me this kind of like squirmy feeling in my head that it's just really hard to describe. But, you know, that moment right there with those three staring at me, it was the main feature of my nightmares for months after I was returned. I think I figured out, it took me decades to really figure out the whole thing. I think that what was going on right there was, here I was in this state of total panic, but there was also the recent injury from this blast from the craft, this injury. And it, I think, probably scrambled my brain in a way that neurologically I wasn't responding. I think that what they were trying to do was regain control of me, you know? Normally, when you hear stories about these creatures, they're able to, you know, control people's movements, but they couldn't do that with me. And once they found out that wouldn't work, they took off and left that room. Well, one of the tests that medical tests that I had performed when I was returned was to have a brainwave scan, an EEG, at the Barrows Neurological Center. This was a brain trauma hospital, world famous in Phoenix, Arizona. It was fortunate that because of the huge media pressure, the doctor that prescribed this test put me in there under an assumed name. So the technician that was performing the tests and reviewing the results was not aware of who I was. And that makes it more valuable because he's not being biased by what he thinks might have happened to me or anything. He was just told to look for signs of trauma or brain injury. And he did find an anomalous brainwave pattern. I'm going to try to remember the wording of it. I still have a copy of that. It was a bisynchronous wave alternating from front to back. And I'm not sure what that means, you know, but I am intending to have a follow-up EEG to see if that pattern is still there, and also to find out from another, neuroscientist what the significance of that might be in terms of brain trauma, injury, whatever. And I think it is a possibility that this anomaly that they detected had something to do with their inability to control me, and something to do with the energy that had passed through me there when I approached the craft. So that's one of the ongoing points of research that will be going on. But anyway, when they were unable to control me, and they probably took seriously my threatening gestures, I was thinking of fighting my way past them, because I could see that the only door was on the other side of them. So I was thinking of making my escape that direction, and they just took off and went out. This was it. This feeling of suffocation, the feeling of being trapped, the pain that was with me, all of those things all combined to just peg the meter on fear, and it was just, so many people say, well, I wouldn't act like that. I would stay calm and ask good questions, But, maybe under different circumstances, maybe I'd have been a little more in control. But everyone imagines that they would handle something like that better than they might actually, if they're actually in that situation. But when they had gone out the door, they had gone down this passageway to the right. And so I went to the left, of course, and I was just kind of in a panic hurry. I was still very weak and unsteady on my feet, but I was afraid that they were coming after me. But the hallway curved so tightly you couldn't see very far ahead, and you couldn't see very far back. And so I couldn't tell if they were behind me, and also couldn't tell if I was running into something worse up ahead. So I, in just kind of a panic burst, I actually went past the doorway. It was probably a better chance of escape than the way I finally chose. But I came to another door on the right, and looking in, I saw a room that was round and empty of creatures or any living being, as far as I could tell. I was afraid that there could be someone sitting in the chair that I couldn't see because it had a high back to it. So I sidled along the wall until I could get around and see, and could see that there was no one sitting in it. However, once I moved into the room, it would darken. And, my mind's going 90 million miles an hour thinking, how can I get out of here? But when I was looking across the room, I could see what looked like doorways, just a rectangle in the wall that I thought might be a door that I could open to escape. And, piecing together the layout later, I can see that there's no way those doors could have led to the outside. But at that point, I was just thinking, if I open the door, maybe I could get out, or at least be a passageway to the outside. And I was even, so unclear in my thinking that I was thinking that if I could open the door, I could just drop 15 feet to the ground and be back in the woods. Although it's pretty unlikely that the craft was still in the woods at that point. So I approached the doors to see if I could open them. There was no doorknob, no latch, no button to open it. It's just a rectangle with no apparent way to open it. So I went to the chair in the middle of the room. But when I moved into the room, it would darken. And as it darkened, I could see points of light all around, even on the floor. And, on or through the floor. I'm not sure whether this was like a planetarium-like projection of points of light onto the wall, or if there was some way that this was creating the effect of seeing where the craft was actually at. But the main interest in the chair for me was, you know, perhaps the only buttons or switches or anything that I thought might open the door were on the chair. So I started pushing buttons on the chair, just colored squares really, and none of those seemed to do anything. Well, some of them caused these lines on the screen to move, but it was like a lighted green screen with black lines at different angles with little segmented sections on them. And some of them would make those slide around, but I couldn't see any symbols, and it didn't seem to me that you could keep track of what that was supposed to be calculating. But somebody suggested that there was possibly symbols that were in a different frequency than the human eye sees, you know. Some animals can see in infrared or ultraviolet, and we have a more limited spectrum. So that was interesting that, you know, the lack of writing from my point of view might have just been because, you know, there was some frequency of light that was not visible to our eyes. But touchscreen had not been invented in 1975, so it never even occurred to me to touch the screen. However, the lever on the left arm of the chair did tempt me. And when I moved that, these points of light that I described started to move. And, you know, I was already kind of dizzy and unbalanced. And that just gave this really weird, sickening feeling to have every point of reference that you're looking at moving in unison. And so I decided I'm not going to mess with that anymore, because, you know. And then I figured, well, what if that thing is, that lever is steering where this thing is at, you know? I could crash it or something. Finally, I got a little glimmer of sense there, huh? But I was thinking of pushing some more of the buttons, and then something caught my attention from the door that I'd come through. And I turned, and there was a man standing there, what I took to be a human being at first. And, you know, I immediately just assumed that there was somebody from the military or law enforcement that was there to rescue me. And so he came towards me, I rushed up to him, and I started just screaming questions at him. And you gotta understand, I was completely out of my mind with fear this whole time. So, you know, I was pretty irrational to him. You know, I must look pretty crazy with fear. But I was screaming about these creatures in there, but he wasn't answering. There was very little response. It wasn't like he was completely unemotional. He just had a sort of a bemused or tolerant look on his face. But when he, you know, took me by the arm and wanted me to go out of there, I was fine with that and get me out of here, you know. So he took me on down the passageway in the direction I'd been going, and through what I think was probably an airlock, because it was just this little hallway that barely big enough to stand in, and then it opened on the other side and we went out. But when we went out, it was so much brighter and cooler outside there that you know, it was actually painful visually, you know, to have that bright of a light suddenly. Didn't realize just how dim it had been inside there. Which, you know, like I said, the dimness, the humidity, and the lack of oxygen or whatever it was, you know, yeah, I did feel better as far as my breathing once I got outside, but, you know, I don't know whether that was partially the diminishing fear, you know, only somewhat, that, you know, we were away from those creatures, and that, you know, that I'd been rescued. And the light outside was so much brighter and more like sunlight, that it was cooler, and, you know, that was kind of refreshing. But I was still pretty weak and dizzy and unsteady on my feet. So when he wanted me to go down this ramp, it seemed way too steep to be walking down. He held on to me, and I got down and I was having to pay pretty close attention to not fall down because he was rushing me, and I was still unsteady. But I look around and I see at least two, I'm sure at least two, of other sort of disc-shaped craft, but they were like smoother and shinier, more mirror-like and more rounded. And there might have been a third one, I'm not sure, because I was, mainly concerned with where is he taking me and what's going on here. So this room that this thing was parked in was like a huge airplane hangar, I think. But I'm not really sure whether it was a building somewhere or part of a larger craft. And it's even possible that the whole thing, that this craft was taken in here and deposited in this hangar-like thing in response to my fiddling with the controls, or perhaps it was never even moving the whole time I'm trying to find a way out. It was sitting here the whole time, because I never did feel any sense of motion or hear any engine sounds. So either if it was flying and if it was making the same sound that it made when we saw it in the woods, you couldn't hear it from inside. Either that or it was just already parked inside here, I don't know. But I was concerned with where he was taking me, and this room was shaped like a quarter of a cylinder, turned on its side. So the back wall behind where we were, the direction we were moving, curved up to form the ceiling, and it intersected with the straight wall, vertical wall, that I moved out of through some doorways that he took me through. And he took me down this hallway and into a room. And there were some other people in there, and they looked a lot like him. And what really contributed to that impression was the fact that they were dressed the same as him, these blue coveralls. And except for one thing, no helmet. And I'd given up, even though I, kept on, badgering him to answer me my questions about who I was, what these creatures were, where they were taking me, blah, 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 blah. And it probably didn't make a whole lot of sense anyway, but to him, because I was screaming and interrupting myself and all that, But I figured that probably I wasn't getting much of a response because of that helmet that he was wearing, which again suggests to me that it wasn't just the injury from the beam that was making me so short of breath, that perhaps that atmosphere was not appropriate for human-type creatures. But so these other people that were dressed like him weren't wearing helmets, so that kind of fired me back up on screaming these questions. And these people seemed to be very similar in appearance, but not identical. They weren't like twins or anything. But they weren't answering me either. And so now, the fact that the first guy was not answering me wasn't all that, disconcerting, because maybe it was because of the helmet. But when they wouldn't answer me, then I really thought, well, maybe this isn't a rescue, Maybe they've got bad intentions, So they took me by the arm, and started trying to get me to lay down on this table over there. I'd had enough of this laying on the table stuff, And but when I started to resist, it was because they weren't answering me, and I wanted answers first, and they wouldn't say a word. And so I was still so weak that, that's my excuse for being overpowered, but, there was three of them, and they were so strong, and I was so weak at that point, they got me down onto the table, and then one of them, female, put a mask over my face, and I really, had a burst of panic, and I got my finger under the edge of that mask and tried to pull it away, but before I could, I blacked out. And it wasn't painful, and I know I wasn't hit, but I think it was some kind of gas that was in this thing. I didn't see a hose hook too, but there must have been some sort of a gas compartment on it or something, because I just went out. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up. Now, where in this 5-day period this conscious period was, I don't know. Could have been at the start, or towards the end, or anywhere in between. But I was lying face down. I came to real quickly, I was fairly clear-headed immediately. And I was face down, and my head was on my arm, and there was a light above me. I looked to see where the light was coming from. And just as I looked, it went off. So by the time I could point my eyes towards it, it wasn't lit anymore. But so I don't know whether a light was turned off, or if the whole thing itself had been glowing, or if a hatch had closed. But then there it was, real shiny and smooth, like those other ones that were in the big room. And it was there for just a second while I was looking at it, and then it just shot up into the sky. And there was a slight feeling of warmth, and it stirred the air a little bit. But other than that, it was really quiet, and it was gone from sight so quickly that you would think it would just have to break the sound barrier or make a swooshing sound or something. But it was just really quiet and gone from sight almost instantly. And I'm thinking that, well, maybe just the fact that it wasn't lit made it seem to get tiny so fast that I don't understand how it could move that quickly and not, sound like a crack of a rifle or, some kind of a sound barrier type sound. But, immediately the most important feeling I had right then was that I was free, that even though this is the middle of the night and it's dark, it was very reassuring to be in familiar surroundings, pine trees and paved road, and, none of this alien craft sort of thing. So I could see the lights of the town down below. And I put on a burst of speed to get there. It's the last of my strength, it was just everything I could do, but I ran down into the town, and there was the first building I came to that was lit up. I went and pounded on the door, but nobody came. And it looked like there were lights on, and steam or smoke coming out of the chimney, but I didn't get any response. So I ran on down across another bridge, and there was a service station that was closed, and there was a row of telephone booths there. And the first phone booth I went into was out of order. And I didn't have any more strength left. I was just really, abruptly feeling, what am I going to do now? Because I felt like I couldn't move another inch. But I moved into the other phone booth, the one in the middle, and it worked. And in that part of the country at that time, you didn't even have to have a coin to talk to the operator. So I made a collect call to my brother-in-law, and he thought it was a practical joke and almost hung up on me. Says, I think you have the wrong number. I had no idea. I thought it was still the same night that this happened. I didn't know that 5 days had gone by. But apparently the family had been having just crank call after crank call, and a lot of practical jokes and stupid things going on, so they'd lost any sense of humor about that. But I screamed, and I managed to convince him it was me. So he said, okay, I'll come and get you, get your brother and come and get you. And so I slumped down, and I probably lost consciousness, because it seemed like next thing I knew that it headlights were shining into the phone booth through the glass door there. And my brother come and got me out of there and put me in the truck. And I was just, you know, sobbing hysterically. I just was totally out of control. And he didn't, you know, so somehow it came out that, you know, it became apparent to him that I thought it was still the same night. You know, he's talking about how worried my mom had been or how long the search had been or something like that. And so he said, Travis, feel your face. And, you know, and then I felt that I had a 5-day growth of beard. So, you know, the idea that this was still the same night was gone. But, you know, it was just for some reason such an extra straw that broke the camel's back. I just kind of went catatonic at that point and was unable to do much more than, you know, cry. But he took me in there back at the Snowflake and talked to showed me to my mom, and that was greatly relieving for her. That was a really extremely, you know, intense reunion because, you know, they'd all but given me up for dead. And so turns out that the operator had broken the law and listened in on the phone call and reported it to the sheriff. Well, you know, I'm glad she did because some of the skeptics had all kinds of theories that I was really somewhere else. So, you know, the fact that the sheriff sent somebody out there to fingerprint that phone booth that night is proof that they knew I was there. But facts like that don't interfere with the skeptics. Never mind the facts. So those phone booths are still there. There aren't any phone booths anywhere else in our area anywhere. Those are not hooked up to any phone lines. They're just they're there as a kind of a landmark now because of what happened there. And so, you know, if you drive through Heber, Arizona, the only phone booths there are the phone booths that I went into that night here 38 years later. So my brother was very concerned that, you know, that I needed medical checkup right away, you know. And it was such craziness around Snowflake because of the media intensity. There was, you know, camera crews everywhere and crank calls and all kinds of curious people. And you know, Steve says that, you know, they were trying to take pictures of him through his bedroom window and stomping through my mom's flower bed trying to take pictures through the window. Just constant phone ringing. It was not just harassing the families, but even the law enforcement people. Phone never stopped ringing. And it was just such a madhouse. My brother said, there's no way that, you know, Travis can withstand this pressure here in the condition he's in. And he was intent on getting me medical help. Well, during the search, there had been a UFO investigator out there who said, hey, we've got doctors in our membership and we can take care of this. And so if he should ever be returned, just be careful who gets a hold of him, but come to us. So that's what he did. He didn't even report that I was returned to the sheriff. And like I said about the polygraph test, the suspicion that there was a cover-up underway was pretty intense with the families of the crew. So my brother just decided to take me to Phoenix to get medical help. And so he was pouring gas into his truck because, you know, all gas stations were closed at night. And he was pouring a gas can into his truck, and the deputy came by on orders from the sheriff. And said, what are you doing? I said, I'm going home. And going back to Phoenix. And so the deputy went back to bed and went home. And, you know, I was in the house with my mom. But it's a good thing, too, because I was in no condition to be interviewed by anybody. And so very next morning, he took me over to this supposed doctor in this ufologist's organization. And turned out the guy was a total phony. He was not a medical doctor at all. And so we left. But because they lost the case, they went to the media and started just making outlandish claims, one of which was that I was hallucinating on drugs and I was afraid that this guy would find that out, which is not reasonable at all, because we immediately turned around and went with some legitimate doctors in another UFO organization who did perform all these medical tests, and among which was proof that there was no trace of any drug in my body. There was blood and urine samples that were put through the county medical examiner's drug screen, which showed there was no trace of any drug in my body. There was also questions on 2 or 3 of my lie detector tests. And so, you know, it didn't make any difference what the facts were. People were eager to grab onto anything that would explain this away for them. And, you know, there was plenty of skeptics around, you know, willing to offer up a theory that would help them to do just that, explain it away. And so one theory was the drug hallucination. Never mind that the medical tests and the lie detector test disproved that. That one's still floating around on the internet. Another theory was that I had a transitory psychosis, became temporarily insane. So, and another theory was that the hypnotist, who finally allowed me to be able to relate what had happened, because I was so traumatized I couldn't even get the story out. But the hypnotist, you know, divided and separated the memory of what happened from the fear I was experiencing. And so I was able to, you know, reduce the fear enough to where I could at least tell the researchers what had happened to me. But, you know, the theory was that the hypnotist had planted these memories in my mind. But there you had 3 theories that, you know, made it a delusion of mine that would allow me to believe it and pass a lie detector test, but you know, not consistent with reality. However, what no one seemed to think of when these theories were offered up and accepted was, how do 7 people have the same hallucination? You know, they weren't hypnotized, you know, and you know, you don't have 7 people have a transitory psychosis, and certainly, you know, a drug hallucination, nobody, you're never going to have 7 people believe they see the same thing that's not there. So those kinds of explanations were just how far they would reach to try to explain it away. There were other theories, but I went in my book and took each theory that the skeptics offered up and presented the evidence that totally discredited those theories. And yet, nevertheless, these kinds of things persist to this day. You can go online and find skeptics that are still offering the drug hallucination thing or whatever. And when I go on there and I try to present the evidence that that isn't true, they won't let me post. Now, but if you want to go on there and post something bad about me, even if you just make it up, fine, they're open for that. Hey, come on, you know. And I've got examples of that where they don't question it if it's against it, but they won't even allow it if it supports it. So, you know, skeptics are not interested in the truth. You know, it's more of a propaganda thing than you know, a superior vision of reality or something. There's my brother who passed away a couple of years ago, and you know, I owe him a huge debt of gratitude about his protection and strength during those days that I was at the weakest I've ever been in my life. I wouldn't have survived those days mentally, or maybe even physically. But you know, the legitimate organization at that time was the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, who had you know, legitimate medical doctors who performed a whole battery of tests. I told you about the EKG, the EEG. I had an EKG, you know, urinalysis, blood samples, you know, thorough physical examination, a variety of different tests to make sure I was okay and to, you know, possibly find some anomaly in connection with the experience. Dr. James Harder at the University of California at Berkeley performed the hypnosis. Dr. Leo Sprinkle, reviewed medical tests performed by others, not medical, psychological tests. He was the director of counseling and testing at the University of Wyoming, and determined that these scores fell within a totally normal pattern of scores psychologically. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was famous as the one in charge of Project Blue Book for the Air Force. You know, you probably heard of the famous swamp gas explanation to explain away UFO incidents. And however, Dr. Hynek sort of had a change of heart after leaving Air Force employment and became very concerned about the residue of reports that were left over. And that residue of reports, that were supposedly 701 reports that could not be explained as being meteors or weather balloons or swamp gas. That was a famous artifact of Project Blue Book. And so he became more of an advocate that there was a reality to this phenomenon. And he issued a statement to the media the day following my meeting with him, and saying that he believed that I was the subject of a lot of unfounded accusations. And, you know, like I said, the main feature of my nightmares in the months following that incident was the eyes of those creatures boring into me in that way. And how are we doing on time?
Go to the parade.
Okay, well, you know what, there's a lot more to tell, but I've gone into a little more detail about what actually happened than I usually do, which leaves no time to talk about some other things that are quite relevant, a lot of ongoing research. But TravisWalton.com is my website, and I also, unfortunately, did not bring enough books, and so anyone who would like a copy, anyone who pays for it here will get free shipping. It'll still be personally autographed as usual. And I'll just take name and address and everything and get it delivered to you as soon as possible. But I'm all out, but I appreciate you listening. We're going to go to the parade downtown now, and so thanks a lot. Thank you.
We were going to have a Q&A session, but we ran out of time. The parade awaits for no one. But Travis is going to be at Greenwood Park, and you can come up and visit with him personally, one-on-one. You know, he'll be there for a while. So he'll be over at Greenwood Park, as will all of us participants in the festival. We're going to have a little parade from the front of the theater to Greenwood Park, and then after that, assuming that we are still in one piece, we will see everybody there at Greenwood Park for the extravaganza. Thank you.